Hello and welcome back to Send Searchlights. I would just like to mention the usual reminders before we get started. So if you could please stay on mute during the session. However, if you do have any questions or need any clarification on today's topic, please do use the chat box. Any questions for future webinars can be submitted using the registration form, which will be sent after the webinar, along with the recording and any links to resources mentioned during the webinar. During today's session, we will focus on dyscalculia, discuss the complexities of maths and how we can best support young people with their learning. I would like to introduce Andy Small, who is an education specialist at Renaissance Global, specialising in numeracy and mathematics. Andy is a former primary school teacher, leading mathematics for the vast majority of his time in schools, and latterly adding leadership to his responsibilities. He's passionate about fostering an enjoyment of maths and a lifelong understanding of maths and number, as well as supporting youngsters for whom maths can be difficult. Andy initially joined our Assessment Insights team, supporting schools using his knowledge on how assessment can be used to enhance school practice and to improve learners' outcomes. He now works across the company on making sure that our maths and numeracy offerings meet the needs of our schools. I will now hand you over to Andy.
Thank you, Debbie. And I feel a bit like a conduit here. I'm going to pass the baton on quite quickly to Pete Garrett. Pete is a specialist teacher and assessor of learners with specific learning difficulties, and an experienced maths teacher himself. He works with learners who struggle to engage with mathematics and supports teachers around the world to be more effective in their practice where working with those students is concerned. As well as this, Pete is chair of the British Dyslexia Association Dyscalculia Committee. He's a member of the advisory board for the Dyscalculia Network and on the editorial board for Equals Online, the Maths Association Journal of Maths and Send. We're really pleased that you're able to join us this morning, Pete, and to consider three key questions. So they being, how might we begin to understand some of the challenges that exist for some learners in mathematics? Why might these even be the case? And what can we do as practitioners to mitigate these challenges? And so, Pete, I throw it over to you.
Well, thanks, Andy. And hello, everybody. Lovely to see such a large number of people. Just looking through, I love it when everybody puts up where they are, and I think we've gone from Hong Kong to Harrogate today, which is you know, a massive spread of how far the sun has travelled today. I want to obviously, you know, just hit on the complexity and how we can unpick the complexity in the maths classroom. So I'm fundamentally, I've got about 3 slides that I want to show, which just underpin that complexity, and then just sort of open it up to thinking some of my ideas about how we unpick that, and maybe then have some time for some questions afterwards. So I will quickly share my slides, which worked just now, and it looks like they're working again. So rather than talking about mathematics, what we learn at this stage, I want to focus on functional numeracy. That's the way that we would use number in every day in our lives as adults. You know, understanding the passage of time in terms of travel, booking things, managing our bank accounts, all of that kind of thing. When we actually look at what impacts our development of solid functional numeracy skills, essentially being numerate in the world, there are so many things that impact that. Firstly, we've got to take the family in terms of the environmental impact here. Now, there is evidence across all the specific learning difficulties of genetic components. I think it would be more accurate to say that combinations of genes generate risk scores. So the potential within an individual of there being a challenge in certain areas. What we're also seeing is the genes overlap. In other words, clusters of genes may lead to problems with literacy, dyslexia, or may lead to problems with mathematics, or may lead to both. And those overlap again with those genes that seem to indicate attention difficulties. So we don't fully understand where we are in terms of the genetic component, but it does exist. The second important thing about the family is the home maths environment. What I particularly like about that, I didn't see anybody from India crop up, but I'm just going to use this as a very quick example. We usually learn to count at home as a child, a toddler, as we're developing language, and we start to and we're developing ideas of magnitude. We start to make a relationship between the language that we use and the magnitude that we're explaining. And when we learn to count, we learn to count in the language that's spoken at home. So in India, that might be a regional language. What happens, for example, Marathi or Gujarati? We then go to a school which might be, I'm going to use English medium because I'm currently speaking in English. We then go to a school which teaches in English. So we have to move from the language we learn to count in to the language of communication of what we've actually learned, the language of instruction. And what that means is that we have probably learned to count intuitively in the native language, in the first language, and then we're communicating that in another language. And I did some work in India quite recently where we were talking to experienced people who work with a very high level of mathematics, and they still do foundational arithmetic. They do the calculations in their native language and then translate that into the language they're communicating in. So that home maths environment, both in terms of language, but also then parental engagement with mathematics, is really important. Then socioeconomic factors. So the family plays a large role. And then we actually have what happens in the individual. So there are things which are developmental. And with dyscalculia or dyslexia, we're talking about neurodevelopmental disorders. So we do recognize that there are particular parts of the brain which handle certain things, and I'm going to talk about that now. And that is particularly, we think, in currently can be divided into domain general, which are things outside of the maths classroom, things like language development and executive function, and domain specific, which are magnitude relationships. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then we also have the emotional side of it. But depending on where you are in the world, there's a very strong sort of feeling that in some places, people who struggle with mathematics, for all the reasons that were on this slide, say, I'm just bad at mathematics. That's it. So we do have, I'm going to call them attitudinal problems, but I mean that in terms of how we perceive mathematics and what that means for our nervous system in terms of how we define the schemas that run it. And then we have the school. And the school environment is where we take generally most of these foundational abilities and turn them into the ability to pass exams, academic attainment, but also to actually develop the function numeracy that people need in everyday life. So we're dealing with an awful lot of complexity, but all we can deal with is understanding the individual, to some extent understanding the family, particularly things like first language of counting, and then think about how we as educators can actually manage that in the school. I think a very nice A colleague of mine, Camilla Gilmore, who's based at Loughborough University here in the UK, has built this very nice model for thinking about mathematics. And we see at the bottom that we have what we call the basic mathematical processes. These are things like counting, estimation, recognizing the magnitude. So working in being able to read place value and working in different place value, all of those kind of basic things that we need to, from a cognition point of view, understand. And then we have the general cognitive skills, this executive functioning. So that's the ability to pay attention, sustained attention, the ability to some extent to hold information and manipulate information, or hold information and then store it into long-term information and long-term memory and retrieve it. And language development. And of course, language development, here we are, global audience, and presumably different mediums of instruction and different means of home language. But mathematics, if we take the language away from it, what we're actually doing with the numbers, so if we use traditional ways of exploring it, is a global language. But the language of instruction and the development in the language of instruction then becomes really important. The language of naming numbers and naming processes, all of those kinds of things. So we have these basic mathematical processes and general cognitive skills. In the UK, we've been working on coming up with what we call a working definition for dyscalculia. We've just published one for dyslexia. These are intended to be forward-facing definitions, so they're not really for research, or they're to help assessors and teachers understand what they need to look for in terms of recognizing what the problem is with somebody attaining in mathematics. And this is absolutely key. The more data, the more useful data, the more nuanced, narrowed down data that we have, the easier it is to recognize what the problem is. If we want to move away from this, I'm just bad at maths, we need to think quite deeply about what the problem the learner is experiencing in that maths classroom. And these difference between these basic mathematical processes, which I would refer to as domain specific, and these general cognitive skills that we might see happening across the learning environment. So not just specific to mathematics, happening across the learning environment. The difference between recognizing these two things does actually impact how we put intervention in, how we actually support those. I just want to touch very quickly, without going into it in too much detail, and I'm not going to run. I've got one slide that's got animations. I'm going to run through it. I'm not going to talk through the animations. I just want to do this. But we have parts of the brain that we recognize have a very specific impact on number processing. Now, neuroscience and the neuroscience of mathematics cognition is a fine example of the more we know about something, the less we know. But we have always recognized that the intraparietal sulcus, excuse me, I'll just go back, which is sort of there in your brain, so just above your ear towards the crown of your head, seems to be the part that when we're dealing with number processing, seems to be the part that is consistently the most active or inactive. So that's actually where we have this kind of number sense root, but it's more complex than that, of course it is. And then we have things like, as I said, working memory, verbal memory, fact retrieval, symbolic recognition, and visuospatial attention. And as I'm going through this list of things, working memory, so how much information you can hold in your head, mental arithmetic, verbal memory, remembering what you've just been told, retrieving your maths facts, recognizing the symbols, and computing space. It's very clear to see how all of these then impact on mathematics. So what do we need to consider? Well, I quite like using AI to generate it. So although it's complex, what we're not trying to do is to fit an elephant in an aeroplane seat. That is just unfeasible and impractical. So what sort of things can we do as teachers? So I'm bearing in mind the time, and I want to ask some questions. I'm just going to break this down into 3 fundamentals. The first is that we need to create a community of practice. And we do that for 2 reasons. What I mean by a community of practice is we create a place in which doing mathematics is developmental, it feels safe, and it allows students to belong in doing mathematics. That sounds rather sort of fuzzy and woolly, and it is, but I will narrow down to that. But the key point to that is making mathematics safe and making it understandable. So the second thing relates to what we are learning increasingly about what is engaging for mathematics and what we have tended not to do. So the first thing is that we need good data. We need to understand whether these are numerical processes, whether these are executive functioning processes, whether this is mathematics anxiety, which is a specific anxiety, or there is something else impacting on somebody's attainment in the classroom. Of course, that's where Renaissance and diagnostic assessment, both in terms of diagnosing a category, but also diagnosing a problem, comes in. So I won't touch on that. The second area after the data is actually then understanding what we need to do in terms of targeted interventions. So for things like executive function, so if we're talking about memory difficulties, we're looking very much at scaffolding. So we are giving people tools that enable them to work with low cognitive load. So I'll give you an example of this, that we spend a lot of time working with repetitive rote learning of times tables facts in the UK and in other places as well. That's actually measuring somebody's executive function as much as it's building a memory of their mathematical cognition. But if we accept that not everybody has the same level of efficiency of executive function, and that actually training working memory has been shown to not be particularly effective, we need to scaffold that. So what we might do is actually give somebody a times table grid, allow them to fill out the times tables that they're particularly able to work with. 1s, 2s, 5s, 10s, everybody can do, and different levels of 3s, 4s. It's the 7 times table that everybody has a problem with because there's no repetitive pattern. The students not only repeating the times tables, but learning to write them out. Now, to be effective learning to write them out, they also need to be able to use repeated addition. It's less efficient, but it's very effective. So if they're working on the 7 times table, being able to add 7 on to a number, and cumulatively doing that. Now, to enable somebody to do that, and if you think about how you do mental arithmetic in your head, what we might have to do with some learners is teach them to decompose the number 7, perhaps by adding a 5 and then a 2 on, or a 4 and a 3. So by giving people scaffolds and techniques, we're starting to build ways in which they can overcome their difficulties, which they keep practicing with, and as they keep practicing it with, they become more efficient. So there are things that we can do for people with executive function, and let's use the term scaffolding. For people with difficulties in numerical processing, there are 2 things that we can do. The first is that an impairment in numerical processing doesn't mean that there won't be other underlying skills that somebody has. When we have worked with students with dyscalculia who have done well in terms of attaining a maths exam, they have often used either their literacy skills or very sound problem solving skills, or actually a very good memory for process to actually go through it. So almost in a way, with people with dyscalculia, we give them the scaffold, but we also try and understand what their strengths are and utilize their strengths to support their numerical processing difficulty. The other thing, and this is becoming increasingly useful throughout the world, and I see it happening all over the world, is that what we now call mastery mathematics, in some cases it'd be called the Singapore approach, but this concrete pictorial abstract approach, we have been using to support people with mathematics learning difficulties for the last 20 or 30 years, but it's the last 10 years that it's become fashionable across the wider classroom. So where we are giving people concrete representations, so that can be using manipulatives in the classroom, or we're using pictures, rather than going straight into the abstract, we're seeing very strong evidence that is particularly helpful. So a combination of concrete pictorial abstract and utilizing strengths for people with dyscalculia. Well, that's it really. Those are the things. So just to sum up, the process of mathematics learning is complex, but let's unpick that a little bit. Really, we're looking at executive functioning, which we support with scaffolding techniques. So we give people heuristics, we give people tools to do that. And we have people with numerical cognition inefficiencies. And that is a combination of concrete pictorial abstract approach, which is shown to be more effective, and an element of recognizing, going back to the data, where their actual difficulty is. Andy, that was a real rattle through. I love doing this in 15 minutes. It's quite a challenge, because normally I talk for about 3 days on this.
Well, quite. And yeah, I mean, I know how much research and ongoing learning there is in this space, and so to do it justice as you've done in such a short space of time is massively to your credit. And thank you for the overview that you've given us. I mean, I'm sure that that colleagues on the call may well have some questions for you, and I will try to monitor the chat as I ask a couple of my own, if that's okay with you, Pete.
Yeah, please.
And actually, the last thing you spoke to there around CPA approaches and the idea of facilitating learning and mass learning using concrete materials and pictures. I know that there are some materials out there that are particularly adapted or particularly useful to a learner with a math specific learning challenge. Are there any specific individual resources or places where you'd advise colleagues on the call to look for such things? I mean, I remember using something called a num drum, for example, when I was teaching, which is basically a cylindrical number square. It's fantastic, and really took away the barrier of having to make jumps from every multiple of 10 to the next numeral, because of the fact it was a helix. I mean, that for me was quite transformational for some of my learners. But
I think, yeah, and I think what we have to remember as teachers is actually what we've got to look for is the impact of whatever we're using, not how we think it looks good, because that's actually reflecting how we think about number,
of course,
but what the impact is. And I think the impact is actually also controlled by how the teacher explains it to make it accessible. So I particularly, I like sort of Dean's blocks, number cubes, tens, hundreds, squares, because those are very visual. But I tend to work with slightly older learners, where place value is much more crucial. So that gives me a target for that. If we take it back, I'm a great believer in a screwdriver approach. So the screwdriver we know is for taking screws out, but when we want to open a paint pot, it's the first thing we reach for. So I love the idea of having things that are familiar to people we might not use in the real that we use for one thing in the real world, but we can actually take into the mathematics classroom. So good example of that for me is a tape measure, which is your number line.
Yeah.
Yeah. So counters. I think things that you can represent number in both formal and informal ways. So there is two color counters. I got told off for calling them two-sided counters at one point because every counter has got two sides, which, depending on where you buy them from, I tend to be yellow and red on one side, on either side, or blue and green, depending on which manufacturer of two-color counters. But those are really good because you can show the relationships within, for example, a 10 frame. And they're also really good for working with negative numbers, so that things like that are really useful, and you can use them in a lot of places. I mean, I left my box of concrete manipulatives in India, unfortunately. So I don't have it with me. But anything that you can use to demonstrate more than one thing, because what that gives it consistency then of the concrete material. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is something that I have seen happen, I have to say, in other countries better than it happens in the UK, is blending the concrete, the pictorial, and the abstract in the classroom all at the same time together, rather than, as we sometimes have a habit of doing in the UK, doing the concrete, then drawing the picture, then working on the abstract, so that the student is seeing the blending of everything. The other thing is that when you're using these concrete tools like TENS blocks and things, is getting the students then to make representations with those as well. So I think it's down to teacher choice, but recognizing the impact. So we're back to the data again.
Yeah,
it's pretty a long-winded way of being vague, isn't it?
No, that's all good. And I know there's been a couple of comments in the chat about the use of concrete materials with older learners. I know, although a lot of my practice with primary, you spoke about two-sided, two-coloured. There, I'm at it now, Pete. Two-coloured counters. I know how useful that is for teaching algebra, for example. And for me, it comes back to what you said about that community of practice and students feeling safe, it being normalised that these materials and these images are just as effective a way of learning mathematics and engaging with mathematics as any abstracts approach.
Yeah, and I think so. Remember, in the old days, we used to have money. We used to have coins and notes. We don't have those very often these days because it doesn't matter where you are. Somebody's already got a card machine. But again, those are really good examples of when you take a concrete material and money, you only use the 1, 2, 5, and 10 times tables in most money systems in the world, but you can make any amount. Is really good, again, is a really good concrete method of doing it. So if you make the relationship in the community of practice all the time between concrete, real world, so tangible is as good a word as concrete. So the other thing is actually taking it into a real life situation that makes sense to a learner rather than an entirely abstract one. All of these things help build that understanding, but most importantly, build the confidence, because when you work with older learners, it's the poor confidence. And of course, Andy, you all know that in primary teaching, where you're not necessarily, sometimes the mathematics has been a real struggle in terms of getting to where you are, that many teachers lack confidence in mathematics as well.
We could do a whole other session around the concept of maths anxiety, and not just in the young people in the classroom, but the more experienced people in the classroom as well.
No, I think just the person you need to talk to for that. But yeah, we'll talk offline about that one.
Maybe we will. I'm very conscious of time, Pete, and we have exhausted what is available to us. And I know there are loads of questions in the chat that sort of seem to come through as you were responding to a couple there. I'm going to throw it over to, I think, Polly, who is going to signpost a couple of things that may well help to answer some of those questions. But what I'd say at the moment, Pete, is thank you very much. That's really insightful. And I can tell already that there is an appetite for more information on this topic. So yeah, watch this space, I would suggest. Thank you very much.
Me and my colleagues, we're always happy to help. So
amazing. Thank you so much. Polly, do you want to pick up
Yes,
from here?
yeah, thank you so much, Pete. That was amazing. I was trying to sort of jot some key reflections down to share my one point that I thought was amazing, but I think there was so much that I've taken away from today that there's too much to share at the moment. And like Andy said, we are tight for time, and we've had some amazing questions come through, but really appreciate you joining us today. It has been amazing. As many of you who join us every month will know, at this point, normally we're done and dusted by now, but it's been worthwhile a little bit of a longer session today. But at this point, we do share those sort of illuminations on how we can continue to support you with students. So today, normally we sort of do a now, next and then, but today we've just got some useful resources, which I will ask Emma to kindly pop the links in the chat as I go along. But first up is just to highlight the Dyscalculia Network website. Lots of resources on this website, really great website. Each month they do have a Q&A drop-in session. Now this is at midday UK time, so I appreciate that this may be inconvenient to some of our international colleagues joining us today. But if it is something that you can attend, then it's definitely worth it. And just so you're not trying to find the next one coming up is the 27th of March. So if you are able to make midday UK time, that's a brilliant one. We've also got our careful calculation report. So as we know, many teachers do struggle to address the maths anxiety and how you can effectively cover the maths curriculum. So this is a great, insightful report drawing on experiences of educators and experts. So in the report, you can find out lots about factors contributing to girls' maths attainment, and also some more practical strategies for identifying and addressing maths anxiety. So do have a look at that careful calculation report. And then just finally, we have our Dyscalculia podcast, where we join the dots on lots of key topics of maths, and hear from listeners sharing the challenges they're currently facing around that core topic. So we hope you find those resources useful. Lots and lots to digest today. So I will now hand over to Emma, who's going to actually tell us about next month.
Absolutely, and I'm going to just echo the same sentiments from Andy and Polly, if I may, Pete, before I move on. Lots that resonated there, especially the talk of times tables by 2s, 5s and 10s. I'm not ashamed to admit that's still how I operate. Times tables and I have never been the best of friends, but I get by that, and the repeated addition are definitely strategies that work for me. So
it works,
thank you so much. It absolutely does. It might take a second longer than that immediate recall, but it definitely works for me. So I appreciate hearing that, and it resonated. So the penultimate week of March is Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and perhaps some of you have already got that in your calendar and are planning events within your particular settings to acknowledge the differences in the way that we think and that our learners think. This event was started in 2018 by a 16-year-old, Sienna Castleton, who herself is neurodiverse, and her intention was to challenge the misconceptions and stereotypes that she felt prevented autistic people and people with learning disabilities from reaching their potential. And it's really lovely to understand that the organisers in that event remind us that our brains all are wired to think, process, move, communicate in different ways, and that our communities benefit from having those different thinkers. In fact, that was a conversation that we were having just this morning before we went live. And we do know that approximately 15 to 20% of the population has a neurological difference. So instead of labelling people with deficits or disorders, the terminology of neurodiversity encourages to take that really important balanced view of an individual's strengths alongside their challenges. And the reality is that in many cases, those challenges that neurodivergent people face are more often to do with the environment or systems than anything that might be in person. And we received a really lovely question recently from a colleague who, and we would continue to encourage you to submit those to us because that's how we form these sessions, who referenced the superpowers of being somebody with dyslexia themselves and supporting learners with dyslexia. So we thought that we would focus around that topic next month. And so therefore, in addition to any questions that we'd welcome you to submit, we wondered if we could invite you to share some examples of those superpowers, those strengths and talents that maybe you've experienced in your learners or in yourself. And we won't be sharing any personal details, so feel comfortable to share as you see fit. And we'll be sharing more about that on our next session, which is going to be April the 8th. And we'll be thinking about the various different ways in which we can help the learners in our settings by making sure that we play to their strengths. And Pete made that very reference in terms of utilising the strengths that a learner might have when they're learning within the mathematics classroom. So how else can we help them to be more domain general as well in other aspects, to build their confidence and their self-esteem, to make sure they have every opportunity to flourish. In the meantime, you might want to visit the Neurodiversity Celebration website, Celebration Week website, excuse me, which is www.neurodiversityweek.com. And I think you've probably heard enough from all of us for today. We do hope that you found huge value in the session. We've captured any of the questions that we didn't have time for Pete to answer, and we'll do our very best to make sure that we can find a way to get the information to you that you need to support your learners going forward. Thank you once again, Pete. It's been an absolute pleasure, and to Andy as well. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again next month. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.